Okay, so question 82. The will, as the title suggests, this is the will in the broadest sense. A lot of it comes down, a lot of the discussion here is especially in the first two questions, is the relation between the will and necessity. In the first two articles, we'll kind of focus on those. The basic idea here is that Aquinas says, okay, the will, it necessarily desires the ultimate end of happiness or the good. But it's free to choose individual particular goods. So the ultimate end of happiness, which as he'll say is union with God, but the ultimate end of the good or the happiness, we can just leave it kind of broad. That ultimate end of the good or of happiness, the ultimate end of happiness, we're not free to choose whether or not we will that. That part of our nature is naturally to will happiness, just like it's part of our nature to naturally accept the first principles of reason. It's part of our nature naturally to desire food, to stay alive. Aquinas says that's part of our nature, and that doesn't constrain it doesn't coerce our will. We're not, our will is not somehow coerced or unfree because we naturally desire this ultimate end. That's, again, he says, actually being able to act according to your natural inclination, that's sort of what freedom is. So he'll say, that there's this ultimate end of happiness that we necessarily will and desire, but he says individual specific goods, whether or not to pursue this pleasure, whether or not to cultivate this virtue, whether or not to do this, these individual things, he says, we're free to choose among. We're not constrained, we're not impelled in that way to choose particular good things. The ultimate goal of happiness, or the good in the broadest sense, in the ultimate sense, that we necessarily will, but individual good things, he says, we're free to choose among, and therefore we have all kinds of free will in terms of individual choices that we make. Pretty much all of the individual choices that we make, he says, are free in the sense that they're not constrained, or they may be constrained in some ways, but they're not coerced. We're never forced to act against our will, except maybe in very rare circumstances where physical violence does something. But so let's look at the individual articles. Article 1, whether the will desires something of necessity. And again, Aquinas' basic point is that yes, the will does desire happiness, the good, the ultimate end of necessity. He says that's natural necessity, absolute necessity. But again, he says that doesn't mean that the will is unfree or that it's coerced or anything. Again, we have a natural inclination towards the good or towards happiness, and pursuing that inclination, acting on that inclination, being able to follow that desire for the good or for happiness, he says, that's what the will does. The will isn't unfree when it's doing that, even though it's necessary. That's actually when the will is free, is when it's acting according to its natural inclination for the good or for happiness. He says there's another type of necessity, this is all in the responsio, there's another type of necessity called necessity of end. And he says that's where when you desire an ultimate end, but there are necessary things, necessary means to that end. So for instance, the simplest example, most basic example, if you want to stay alive, you have to eat. You can't continue to live if you don't eat anything. If you'll starve to death. So Aquinas says if you desire to stay alive, you have to choose eating as part of the means to that end. There's simply no way around that. And he says, but that's not repugnant to the will. The will is not being coerced in that. It just means that you have to do certain things to achieve a particular end. He says necessity of coercion, that is what is really, as he puts it, repugnant to the will. That's when you're being coerced to do something against your will. He talks about violence. You might think of physical, a person forcing you through violence or the threat of violence to do something. But we'll see. Ultimately, Aquinas says that when you do something out of fear, you're still making a choice. So it's still ultimately voluntary. A pure example of this would be if you were on a ship and a big wave came along and swept you off the deck of the ship. That would be obviously completely repugnant to your will. That would be pure coercion. You're not choosing that at all. You're just being swept overboard. So something like that would be repugnant to the will, as he puts it. That would be coercion in a way that makes the will, that goes against the will's desire. But other things that are basically in line with the natural inclination of the will, again, first of all, the natural inclination of the will itself is not coercion. It doesn't make the will unfree. And again, having to choose particular things to pursue an end that you desire, that doesn't make the will unfree. It's not coercive. It's necessity, but it's not, as he puts it, repugnant to the will. Some of the objections and replies deal with these things, again, often dealing with what Augustine or Aristotle, again, the philosopher is Aristotle, have to say about these things. And basically, again, as he says in reply to objection 1, natural necessity does not take away the liberty of the will. So again, natural necessity does not take away the the liberty of the will, even though it is necessity, even though we're not free to choose otherwise, again, Aquinas says that that doesn't take away the liberty of the will. It just means that that is naturally what we desire. Just like naturally we just automatically accept the first principles of reason. We're not free to decide that the principle of non-contradiction. Something cannot be and not be at the same time. Something cannot be white and not white at the same time. Someone cannot be alive and not alive at the same time. Aquinas says, well, we're not free to choose whether or not to accept that. Other things, two parallel lines will never cross. We're not free to choose whether or not we believe that. That's just self-evident to us. As he puts it in the reply to objection 2, natural things are accepted by reason as well. Natural principles, as he puts it, correspond. The intellect accepts natural principles kind of automatically, and again, he says that doesn't mean that the intellect somehow isn't free. It just means that naturally certain things are just accepted. He says it's the same with the will. We naturally desire the good. It doesn't mean that we're not free. It just means that that's what our nature points to. That's just the way that we are naturally. So let's look at objection 2. Basically, the objector has said that reason can extend to different things. And since the will can as well, it is determined in nothing of necessity. The will is a rational power, as he puts it. The will extends to opposite things, therefore it is determined to nothing of necessity. Basically, to opposite things, if I decide, if I'm not sure whether or not I'll have dinner, I can choose to. I can choose to have dinner. I can choose not to. I can think of more dramatic examples. I would never think this, but should I go out and kill someone? I can think I will. I can think I won't. The will extends to opposite things, but again, Aquinas says the reply to objection 2: the will, so far as it desires a thing naturally, happiness, corresponds rather to the intellect as regards natural principles than to the reason, which extends to opposite things. So again, the intellect, the principle of non-contradiction. Well, is it true? Is it false? It's just self-evident that it's true. So in that way, the intellect doesn't extend to opposite things. It can't kind of consider something self-evident as maybe true, maybe false. No, it's self-evident. Therefore, it just sees it as self-evident. So Aquinas says, in that way, the intellect the will is an intellectual rather than a rational power. It's more like the intellect that just accepts certain things because they're natural, than like the reason that can extend to different things, and in particular opposite things, and decide, is this true? Is this good or not? And so again, in reply to objection 3, again he says basically, as the objector has said, we are not I'll just read objection 3. Further, by the will we are masters of our own actions. That's what the will is. It's our ability to choose, therefore to be in control of our own actions. But the objector says we are not masters of that which is of necessity, therefore the act of the will cannot be necessitated. So the will means that we're masters of our own actions, but we're not masters. We don't have control over that which is of necessity. Therefore, the will cannot be necessitated. The will cannot be a matter of necessity. And again, Aquinas comes back and says, we are masters of our own actions by reason of our being able to choose this or that, to make specific, individual choices. But choice regards not the end, but the means to the end, as the philosopher says. Wherefore the desire of the ultimate end does not regard those actions of which we are masters. So again, Aquinas says we're not free to choose the ultimate end, the end of happiness or the good, but we are free to make individual choices. And so again, he says, and that way the will does not choose the ultimate end, but it is able to choose the means to the end. It's able to make individual choices about individual means, not the ultimate end, but individual choices. So Aquinas says again, the will necessarily desires the ultimate end of happiness, but individual choices, individual goods that it chooses to pursue, individual paths to happiness, the will can make those choices. We're not compelled. We don't of necessity to desire this or that good thing. Though again, so just to further clarify that, though, he goes on in Article 2 and says, well, if the will desires the good of or happiness of necessity, is every act of will, is every desire of necessity? Does every single thing that the will chooses, does it choose that of necessity because it's good? And basically what he says here is, the short answer is no. The will has plenty of choices. So basically, he says, the will again desires the ultimate end, the universal and perfect good of necessity, but not any particular good. So again, as he puts it, the universal and perfect good, the will necessarily desires that, but individual goods, whether or not I should cultivate a particular virtue, that's a choice that I have. whether or not I should, pursue a pleasure, which would be good in the sense of being pleasurable, but maybe not good in other ways. That's a choice that I have. If I have a choice between, let's take vengeance. If I have a choice between the pleasure that I take in revenge and the good that I see in cultivating in forgiving and in cultivating the virtue of charity or love, Aquinas says, I don't necessarily choose charity. I have that choice. I necessarily desire to be happy, but maybe I think that vengeance will make me happy. And so therefore I can choose vengeance, because again, when it comes to individual choices like that, Aquinas says, I have choice. I can choose particular acts like that. I can't decide, well, I think vengeance will make me unhappy, but I want to be unhappy, therefore I'll choose vengeance. Aquinas says, no, you can't do that. Ultimately, everyone desires to be happy, but you can make individual choices about how you think you'll get there, what you think will make you happy. And again, he comes back in the body of his discussion here in the Responsio to a comparison between the will and the intellect. And he says, just as the intellect necessarily adheres to the first principles, so that will adheres to the last end, happiness, the ultimate good. So the intellect necessarily adheres to first principles. It necessarily accepts the first principles of the intellect, again, the principle of non-contradiction, things like that. He says, in the same way, the will necessarily adheres to the last end. The will necessarily desires happiness, which is the last end, the ultimate goal or purpose. But he says, when it comes to contingent propositions, which may or may not be true, remember this distinction between contingent and necessary. Take a simple example. I'm wearing a black shirt today. The intellect doesn't necessarily assert to that. It may or may not be true. But individual conclusions of arguments as well, things that have to be demonstrated, things that have to be proved through argument, the will doesn't necessarily assent to those things. It has to have those things proven. Take the classical syllogism, all human beings are mortal. Socrates is a human being, therefore Socrates is mortal. You accept that Socrates, if the two premises are true, then the conclusion must be true, but it's not self-evident. Until you know who Socrates is and whether or not human beings are mortal and so on, it's not self-evident that Socrates would be mortal. So in the same way, he says, that the intellect is not, the intellect necessarily adheres or accepts first principles, but not necessarily contingent propositions, which may or may not be true. The intellect has to have those shown to it. And so he says, in the same way, the will does not necessarily desire certain particular goods which have no necessary connection to happiness. So I think an example we've used before, money. A certain amount of money may, in Aquinas' view, a certain amount of money may make one person happy. They may be able to use it for good. It may, bring them all kinds of good things, and they may not be, overly concerned with money. They may not use it to indulge their vices. A different person may get the same amount of money, and they may become very greedy. They may become obsessed with money and only want more. They may see what they can get with that little bit of money and decide that they just want more and become very, very, fixated on money to the exclusion of the actual good and actual happiness. And someone else may use that money, again, just to indulge all of their vices. So there's no necessary connection between money and happiness or the good, Aquinas would say. Money may make some people happy if they're able to use it well. Other people who use it poorly or who become obsessed with it, Aquinas would say, it will make them unhappy. So you don't necessarily desire money because there's no necessary connection between money or wealth and the good. So he says, the will doesn't necessarily desire everything of necessity, because not all things are necessarily related to the good. But he says there are some propositions which are derived from first principles, and then he says when there's a kind of a necessary connection between the first principles and particular propositions, and that necessary connection can be demonstrated, then he says the intellect necessarily assents to them. So you can think about geometry. The first principles are self-evident. Two parallel lines will never cross. Once you start to develop proofs from those, he says, then the intellect necessarily accepts those things. They're not self-evident at first, but once the necessary connection between self-evident principles and certain conclusions is established, then he says the intellect necessarily accepts those conclusions. It's seen the connection between these conclusions and the self-evident and therefore necessary to accept first principles, and therefore it accepts the conclusions. And Aquinas says, in the same way, there are particular goods that have a necessary connection to happiness. So go back to the example of vengeance. Aquinas would say there's a necessary connection between the virtue of charity or love and happiness. And he would say that there's a necessary connection between vengeance and unhappiness. Ultimately, that's not good. Vengeance is not a virtue. Violence is not good. None of these things are what you should choose. He would say, that you should choose love and charity and forgiveness and so on. And he would say, again, that there's a necessary connection between these virtues, or between this one virtue and happiness. But he would say, and so he says, when you see the necessary connection between a particular good and happiness, then he says the will necessarily desires that good. Once you can see that there's a necessary connection between a particular good and the ultimate end of happiness, Aquinas says you necessarily desire that as because of its necessary, essential connection to the ultimate end, to the ultimate goal of happiness. But Aquinas says this is not, unlike in the case of reason or the intellect, this is not something that can be demonstrated using argument. He talks about the certitude of divine vision, through which the necessity of such connection might be shown. So basically he says, there are some things that have a necessary connection with happiness, but we don't see it by ourselves, and we can't necessarily have that necessary connection shown to us in a completely irrefutable, undeniable way, using reason or using propositions. He says basically it's divine vision. So there may be a necessary connection between forgiveness and practicing or cultivating the virtue of charity or love and versus revenge. But until I see that, and again Aquinas says reason isn't going to be able to do that. The intellect, arguments, are not going to be able to show it. If you can see clearly through divine vision, as he puts it, the necessary connection between charity or love and happiness, then he says then you will necessarily choose charity or love. But if you don't see that, you might end up choosing vengeance, even though that will necessarily make you unhappy, because again, the opposition here, charity and love versus vengeance, one makes you happy, one doesn't, and Aquinas says that's necessary, but you can't see the necessity there. You can't see the necessary connections. Therefore, you might end up choosing something that actually makes you unhappy. Again, he says if you can see the necessary connection between a particular good and happiness, then you necessarily choose that. But he says, we don't always see it, and it takes, as he puts it, divine vision. Argumentation is not enough. So as he says in the response to the second objection, the will is moved and so determined by, as he puts it, the universal and perfect good, but not by particular goods. So again, individual goods we're free to choose or not to choose. As he says, as the capacity of the will regards the universal and perfect good, its capacity is not subjected to any individual good. So again, we don't desire any individual good of necessity unless, again, we see some sort of necessary connection between a particular good and happiness. Again, as he says in the reply to objection 1, the will can tend to nothing. The will can move towards nothing except under the aspect of good. But because good is of many kinds, for this reason the will is not of necessity determined to one. So again, there are many kinds of goods, and therefore we're not compelled to choose any one of them. The will is inclined to all kinds of different goods, and the individual choice among them, that's ours to make. That doesn't happen through necessity. Article 3, is the will higher power than the intellect? Whether the will is a higher power than the intellect, we don't really need to get into this. Kind of, again, a matter of ranking things that we might think is maybe not really necessary. But Aquinas asks, which is higher, the will or the intellect? Basically, the short answer, it's somewhat complicated, but the short answer is the intellect is higher than the will, because the end of the intellect, truth, is higher than the end of the will, which is good. And then the fourth article, whether the will moves the intellect. Again, this one is somewhat complicated. The basic idea is that there's a bit of an interplay. So as he says at the beginning of the responsio, he says a thing is said to move in two ways. First, as an end. For instance, when we say that the end moves the agent. So in other words, the end which we desire moves us to seek it. And he says, in this way, the intellect moves the will, because the good understood is the object of the will and moves it as an end. But he also says, secondly, a thing is said to move as an agent, as what alters moves what is altered, and what impels moves what is impelled. In this way, the will moves the intellect and all the powers of the soul, as Anselm says. So basically, the basic idea, again, he says this is because wherever we have order among a number of active powers, that power which regards the universal end moves the powers which regard particular ends. So again, the will regards the universal end of the good, therefore we're seeking the good, therefore the will sort of sets everything in motion, but we need the intellect to identify the good so that the will can choose it. You can think of a kind of rough analogy of going to the refrigerator when you're hungry. You open up the door, you look, some of the food is spoiled, or expired. Some of it is just maybe an empty container. There's a package of baking soda in there. You have to look at these things and decide, what can I eat? There's nothing in here. I think this expired 3 days ago. This is baking soda, and then you find something that you can eat. You're there because you're hungry. That your hunger is kind of like the will in Aquinas's account. It's sort of moving you to go and seek food, but the intellect needs to actually figure out, okay, what can I eat? What can I actually eat? And then when the intellect sees something and chooses it, then that kind of sets the will in motion. You say, okay, I'm going to eat this. But very basically, again, we don't need to focus too much on this particular question. The relationship between the will and the intellect, they sort of move each other. So the basic idea here in question 82, again, the will does necessarily desire the ultimate end of happiness, but it's free to choose among individual things, individual goods, to make individual choices, and we'll see some more detail about what free will means and so on in question 83.